My son's coach slashed his playing time after his dad died to favor his own kid. 6 weeks after my husband died, my 12-year-old son went from starting catcher to sitting the bench for entire games, and the coach who benched him was replacing him with his own son. My husband Rutger coached Bodie's travel baseball team himself for 4 years before he got sick, a slow, cruel cancer that took 18 months to finish what it started, and in that time he built something on that team that went well beyond wins and losses. He knew every kid's name, every kid's parents, every kid's particular fear, the one who choked up at the plate with runners in scoring position, the one who needed to be pulled aside and told quietly that a dropped ball wasn't the end of the world. When he got too sick to run practices himself, he handed the team to his assistant coach, a man named Desmond Falkirk who'd been with the program for 2 seasons and who Rutger trusted completely, trusted enough to tell him from a hospital bed near the very end that he wanted Desmond to keep coaching Bodie's team, wanted some continuity for our son when almost nothing else in his life was going to feel continuous anymore. Desmond visited the hospital twice in Rutger's final month, sat with him for long stretches, told him in front of me that he'd take care of the boys, that Bodie would always have a place on that team no matter what happened. I believed him completely, the same way I've come to understand other people believe men like this right up until the moment they stop being believable. Desmond wasn't a stranger who'd shown his true colors from day one. He was a man who'd earned 4 years of trust before he spent it. Rutger died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, 3 weeks before travel season started, and Desmond came to the funeral, gave a short, genuinely moving tribute about the 2 seasons he'd spent learning the game from a man who loved it more purely than almost anyone he'd ever coached with. He hugged Bodie afterward, told him the team needed him more than ever this year, told him Rutger would want him out there playing hard, not sitting home grieving in a way that would make his dad's old teammates worry about him. The first 2 weeks of the season went exactly the way Desmond had promised. Bodie started every game behind the plate, the position he'd played since he was 8, the position Rutger had spent countless evenings in our backyard helping him perfect. The footwork on a steal attempt, the quick release on a throw down to second, the specific stubbornness it takes to keep calling a good game even after you've had a rough at-bat. Bodie wasn't just playing. He was playing well, hitting near the top of the order, throwing out runners at a rate that had college scouts, even at 12, starting to take casual notice of a kid from a small-town travel program. It was the 3rd week when things started to shift. Quietly enough at first that I told myself I was imagining it. Rutger used to say Bodie had the rarest gift a catcher can have, which had nothing to do with arm strength or footwork, though he had plenty of both by 12. He said Bodie had a short memory for failure, that he could let a passed ball or a called third strike roll off him inside of a single pitch, something most kids, most adults, spend a lifetime failing to learn. Rutger spent hundreds of evenings in our backyard drilling that into him anyway, blocking balls in the dirt, working footwork on stolen base attempts, the 2 of them out there some nights until it was too dark to see the seams on the ball, Rutger calling out corrections in a voice I could hear from the kitchen window while I did dishes, patient in a way he wasn't patient about almost anything else in his life. Those evenings kept going, in a smaller, gentler form, even after the diagnosis, even after chemo made his own hands shake too badly to throw batting practice, Rutger sitting in a lawn chair by the back fence instead, calling out the same corrections from a distance, refusing to let the cancer take that particular hour away from either of them until it finally, near the very end, did. The opening weekend of that first travel season without him was hard in a way I don't think either of us fully had words for at the time, both of us walking into that ballpark aware, in a raw, physical way, of exactly whose absence we were standing inside of. Desmond made a point of it before the first game, gathered the team in a circle, said a few words about Coach Rutger that made several of the other parents cry, had the boys wear a small patch on their sleeves with Rutger's initials stitched into it. Bodie played all 7 innings that day, caught every pitch, went 2 for 3 at the plate, and Desmond hugged him afterward in front of everyone, told him his dad would have been proud of the way he called that game, and I remember driving home that night feeling something close to grateful, something close to hopeful, that maybe this team, this man Rutger had trusted with his final wishes, really would carry Bodie through the hardest season of his life the way Rutger had wanted. Desmond's own son Weston was 11, a year younger than the boys on the roster technically allowed for that age bracket, playing up a level the way some coaches' kids conveniently seem to, always a backup catcher. Decent, but not close to Bodie's level, the kind of player who'd get a few innings a game in blowouts and otherwise sat and watched. In week 3, Weston started getting the start in the 2nd game of every weekend doubleheader, with Desmond explaining it to me casually in the parking lot afterward as load management, said he didn't want to burn Bodie out this early in the season given everything he'd been through at home. It sounded reasonable enough at the time. I even thanked him for thinking of Bodie's well-being. By week 4, Weston was starting both games most weekends, with Bodie getting innings only in situations where the outcome was already decided, up 8 runs or down 8 runs. The kind of appearance that technically counts as playing time on paperwork, but means almost nothing to a competitive 12-year-old who used to be the best catcher in the league. When I asked Desmond about it, he told me Bodie still seemed a little checked out at practice, said he wanted to ease him back into full-time duty rather than push him too hard too fast. I asked Bodie that night whether he felt checked out at practice, and he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since the week his father died, and said no, that he felt fine, that he didn't understand why why Coach kept saying that. In Week 5, Desmond moved Bodie to right field entirely for one full game, a position he'd never played in his life, explaining afterward that he wanted to diversify his skill set. And Bodie, who had spent every summer of his childhood behind home plate learning to read a hitter's shoulders before a swing even started, stood out there for 6 innings catching exactly 0 fly balls hit anywhere near him, useless and humiliated in a part of the field he'd never once practiced. It was Week 6, the Tuesday after a Sunday doubleheader where Bodie hadn't played a single defensive inning behind the plate, that I finally sat down and started keeping a record. Dates, innings played, positions, at-bats, the kind of plain accounting I'd later understand mattered enormously, though at the time I was just doing it to keep myself from doubting what I was watching happen to my son. I confronted Desmond directly after a Thursday practice in Week 7, pulled him aside near the equipment shed while the boys packed up their gear, and asked him plainly why Bodie's playing time had dropped so sharply since his father died, why every explanation he'd given me so far had contradicted the one before it. Desmond's easy, warm coaching dad demeanor shifted, just slightly, into something more clipped. He said I was reading too much into normal roster management, that every coach rotates players through different roles over a season, that he understood I was grieving too, and grief could make a parent see conspiracies where there was only ordinary baseball strategy. He said, in a tone that I replayed in my head for days afterward, that he hoped I wasn't going to become one of those parents, the kind who made every lineup decision about their own kid instead of trusting the coach to build the best team. I remember standing there by the equipment shed feeling something twist in my chest that had nothing to do with baseball at all. The specific vertigo of being told calmly and confidently that what you're watching happen with your own eyes isn't actually happening. I'd felt something like it once before in the hospital when a nurse had gently suggested Rutgers' confusion that week was probably nothing, before it turned out to be the beginning of the end. I didn't trust that feeling any less this time, just because it came from a baseball field instead of a hospital room. Week 8 was the game that finally made the pattern impossible for me to talk myself out of. It was the league championship qualifier, the single most important game of the regular season, the kind of game Rutger used to spend the entire week before strategizing over on our kitchen table with a lineup card and a mechanical pencil. Bodie didn't start. He didn't play the first 4 innings at all. When Desmond finally put him in the 5th inning of a game the team was already losing by 6 runs, it was in right field again, not behind the plate, in a defensive alignment that made no tactical sense for a must-win game except as a way of technically satisfying whatever minimum playing time rule the league required, without giving Bodie a single meaningful opportunity to actually help the team win. Weston started and caught the entire qualifying game, went 0 for 3 at the plate, and Desmond stood at the fence afterward, in front of the whole group of parents, and told everyone what a gutsy, mature performance Weston had put in behind the plate under pressure, framing his son's mediocre outing as some kind of leadership milestone, while my son sat 20 feet away on the bench, having barely touched the field in the biggest game of the season, still wearing the catcher's gear he hadn't been allowed to use. I drove home that night with Bodie silent in the passenger seat, and about halfway home, he finally said something, quiet, staring out the window rather than at me. He asked if it was because of Dad. He asked if Coach didn't want him around anymore, because looking at him made everyone remember something sad. I pulled the car over onto the shoulder of the road because I couldn't drive safely while crying that hard, and I held my son in a parking lot outside a gas station for almost 20 minutes, neither of us saying much else, both of us understanding in different ways that something had gone badly wrong that had nothing to do with baseball at all. In the days after the qualifier game, Bodie stopped asking to go to the batting cages on weekends the way he used to, stopped bringing his glove into the living room to oil it while we watched TV in the evenings, a small ritual he and Rutger had done together for years that he'd kept up on his own after his father died, right up until that week. I found his catcher's mitt sitting untouched in the front hall closet for 4 straight days, and when I finally asked him, gently, whether he still wanted to keep playing at all, he shrugged in a way that broke something in me more than any of Desmond's contradictory explanations had, and said he didn't know, said maybe Coach was right that he wasn't playing well enough anymore, said maybe it had nothing to do with Dad at all and he was just making excuses for being bad now. That was the sentence that finally moved me from quietly tracking dates in a notebook to actively looking for someone who could tell me, with real authority, whether what I was watching was ordinary coaching strategy or something worse. I wasn't going to let my son spend the first spring after his father's death internalizing a lie about his own ability because a grown man found it easier to build a story around Bodie's supposed decline than admit what he was actually doing. The person who finally helped me see the full shape of what was happening wasn't anyone I expected. Her name was Marisol Uy, the team's volunteer scorekeeper, a soft-spoken woman who sat in the same fold-out chair behind home plate at every single game with a scorebook she'd kept meticulously, inning by inning, for 3 seasons, a habit she said had started because her own son, a few years older, had aged out of the program and she'd simply never stopped coming to the games or keeping score, said it gave her something to do with her hands and her attention while she watched other people's kids grow up the way she'd watched her own. Marisol found me in the parking lot after the qualifier game, while Bodie was still in the car and I was standing outside it trying to compose myself before I drove, and she said gently that she'd been meaning to talk to me for a few weeks but hadn't known how to bring it up up without seeming like she was interfering in something that wasn't her business. She told me she kept full, detailed scorebooks for every game, innings played, positions, at-bats, and that she'd noticed, going back through her own records out of pure curiosity after Bodie's playing time started dropping, something she thought I deserved to see for myself rather than take her word for. I met her at her kitchen table 2 days later, and she laid out 3 seasons of scorebooks in neat rows, along with a handwritten summary she'd put together herself, dates and innings and positions charted out with a patience that made my chest ache with gratitude. The pattern, once she showed it to me in her own careful handwriting, was worse than even what I'd started to suspect on my own. Bodie's playing time hadn't simply declined gradually since his father's death. It had dropped in near-perfect inverse correlation to Weston's playing time, increasing week over week, almost innings for innings, as though there were a fixed total pool of catching time being reallocated on a strict, deliberate schedule rather than any organic coaching decision responding to performance or need. I've been keeping score for this program for 3 years, Marisol told me, tapping the summary page. I've watched Desmond make plenty of ordinary lineup decisions in that time, plenty of rotations that made sense given who was hot and who wasn't. This isn't that. This is a straight line, practically to the inning, starting the week your husband died. She also told me something I hadn't known, something that had happened the season before Bodie's father died, before I'd started paying close attention to roster decisions at all, because Rutger had still been well enough to coach some practices himself that spring. A boy named Foster Amara, whose family had moved out of state at the end of that prior season, had gone through something eerily similar the year before. A strong starting shortstop who'd suddenly found himself buried on the bench midway through the season, right around the time his own parents went through a difficult public divorce, that Desmond, Marisol remembered clearly, had commented on more than once in the dugout, in a tone she'd found distasteful even at the time without understanding yet what it might mean. Weston, a year younger and playing up, had taken over shortstop duties for most of that season's back half. Marisol still had contact information for Foster's mother, a woman named Perpetua Amara, from an old team parents group chat, and she offered to make the introduction if I wanted it. I called Perpetua that same week, my hands shaking the way they seemed to shake every time I picked up a phone to confirm something I already suspected, but desperately didn't want to be true. Her account matched mine in a way that made my stomach turn. She described watching her son's playing time evaporate over roughly 6 weeks, described Desmond's shifting, contradictory explanations, described being told, almost word for word, that she was becoming one of those parents when she pushed back. She described her son, 12 years old at the time, asking her almost the exact question Bodie had asked me in the car, whether it was because of what was going on at home, whether Coach didn't want him around because of what people might think looking at him. We just left, Perpetua told me, her voice flat with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd made peace with a decision years ago and had never expected to have to think about it again. We didn't fight it. We didn't go to the league. Foster's already dealing with enough, I thought, and I didn't have the energy to take on a coach with 3 years of goodwill built up with every other parent in that program. I've wondered since whether that was a mistake. I think, now, hearing what happened to your son, that it probably was. Marisol's scorebooks and Perpetua's account gave me something I hadn't had before. Proof this wasn't grief making me imagine patterns that weren't there, and proof this wasn't the first time. What I didn't have yet was any idea what to actually do with it, because I understood, even in the depth of my anger, that going straight to the league and accusing a beloved 3-year veteran coach of deliberately sidelining a grieving child in favor of his own son was the kind of accusation that could easily blow back on Bodie far worse than the benching already had, if it came across as an overwrought parent's unprovable grudge rather than a documented pattern. I called Callahan the same night I got off the phone with Perpetua, mostly just to vent, the way I'd been calling him more often since Rutger died, since he was the closest thing left to hearing his brother's voice on certain hard days, the two of them having shared the same low, unhurried way of talking through a problem before reacting to it. I read him the whole story, start to finish, and he went quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, the particular quiet I'd come to recognize as him already starting to think in spreadsheets before he'd even finished expressing sympathy. "Send me everything Marisol has," he said. "Every page. I want to see if this holds up the way a real dataset should." It was my brother-in-law, Rutger's younger brother Callahan, who works in sports data analytics for a minor league franchise, who helped me understand how to actually build the case in a way that couldn't be waved away as anecdote. I sent him Marisol's scorebooks, photographed page by page, along with everything I'd separately tracked myself since week 6, and he spent a weekend building what he called, only half joking, a proper statistical model out of a 12-year-old's baseball season. He calculated Bodie's batting average, on-base percentage, caught stealing rate, and total defensive innings for the first 2 weeks of the season against the same numbers for weeks 3 through 8, and laid them next to Weston's identical statistics across the same windows. The numbers told a story more damning than I think even Callahan expected going in. Bodie's performance metrics in the first 2 weeks had been, statistically, among the best on the team at his position, a caught stealing rate nearly double the league average for his age group, an on-base percentage that put him second in the entire lineup. There was no performance decline in weeks 3 through 8 to explain the drop in playing time. If anything, in the limited innings he did get, his numbers held roughly steady. Weston's numbers, over the same period, were solidly average at best, a caught-stealing rate barely above league minimum, an on-base percentage that ranked him closer to the bottom third of the roster. By any objective measure a rational coach might use to justify a lineup decision, the shift in playing time ran directly opposite to what the actual performance data supported. Callahan built the whole thing into a clean, simple document. Charts, week-by-week playing time next to week-by-week performance. Foster Amara's prior season pattern laid out alongside Bodie's current one in a side-by-side timeline that made the two seasons look almost like tracings of each other. He told me, once he'd finished it, that if I wanted this taken seriously by anyone outside the team's own parent group chat, I needed to take it somewhere with actual authority over the coach. Not a confrontation in a parking lot, not another parents group argument that could get dismissed as drama, but the league's board itself, which every travel program in our region answered to for coaching certification and code of conduct standards. I reached out to the league's regional director, a measured, unhurried woman named Odalie Ferrand, and requested a formal meeting, sending ahead, at her request, everything I had: Marisol's scorebooks, Callahan's statistical analysis, my own week-by-week log, and, with her permission, a written statement from Perpetua Amara describing what had happened to her own son the season before. Odalie read through all of it before we ever met in person, and when we finally sat down together, she told me she took accusations like this extremely seriously, but that she also needed to be careful, procedurally, given how much weight Desmond carried in the regional coaching community after 3 seasons of otherwise clean, well-regarded service. I believe you, she told me near the end of that first meeting. The data is hard to argue with, and having two families independently describe nearly the same pattern, a year apart, makes this something more than a single parent's grievance. But I want to build this the right way before I bring formal action to the board, so it holds up and doesn't just become his word against yours in a room full of parents who've known him for years. Odalie's approach, over the following 3 weeks, was more methodical than anything I'd have known to do on my own. She quietly requested Desmond's full official scorebooks from the league's own record-keeping system, the ones every certified coach was required to submit after each game, and cross-referenced them against Marisol's independently kept version, looking specifically for discrepancies that might suggest the official record had been altered or selectively reported to obscure exactly how lopsided the playing time split had become. She interviewed, discreetly and separately, 2 other assistant coaches who'd been on the field during several of the games in question, neither of whom knew why they were being asked, both of whom, once asked directly, confirmed the same pattern Marisol had documented without any prompting from her account. She also reached out on her own initiative to the league's records from 3 seasons back, the year before Foster Amara's family had left the program, spending, she told me later, an entire evening at her own kitchen table going through boxes of paper files the league still hadn't digitized, the kind of unglamorous administrative work nobody thanks a volunteer regional director for doing. But that turned out to matter more than almost anything else in the case. She found something Perpetua herself hadn't known about, something that widened the pattern further than either of us had realized. There had been a third boy, 2 seasons before Foster, a player named Julius Okonkwo, whose family had filed an informal complaint with the league at the time, alleging almost identical circumstances: declining playing time, coinciding with a family hardship, contradictory explanations from the coach, a shift in position toward Weston, who would have been only 9 that season, but was, according to the complaint, already being worked into playing time ahead of stronger, older teammates during exactly the kind of family crisis that seemed to make a parent least equipped to fight back. The complaint, filed with an earlier regional director who'd since retired, had apparently gone nowhere. Noted in the file only as resolved informally, with no further documentation of what that resolution had actually involved. No interview notes, no follow-up, nothing beyond a single closing line that suggested the family had simply stopped pursuing it once the season ended, and their son moved up an age bracket onto a different coach's roster. Odalie told me when she called to tell me what she'd found, that discovering the buried complaint had changed something for her personally, about how seriously she was going to take the hearing going forward. 3 seasons, 3 families, 3 different kinds of crisis, she said. A divorce, a death, and whatever Julius's family was going through, which the file doesn't even specify. That's not a coach having one bad year of judgment. That's a method. By the time Odalie convened the formal hearing, 5 weeks after our first meeting, she had assembled a case built on 3 separate families spanning 3 seasons, official league scorebooks cross-referenced against Marisol's independent records, Callahan's statistical analysis, and the previously buried complaint from Julius Okonkwo's family that nobody currently on the board had even known existed until Odalie pulled the old file herself. Odalie called me the night before the hearing to walk through what to expect, told me the board's job wasn't to referee an argument between me and Desmond in the room, but to weigh the documentation on its own merits, and that my role, mostly, was simply to answer questions honestly if asked, and otherwise let the record speak for itself. She said something that stuck with me through the whole sleepless night that followed, that in her years running this league, the hearings that actually changed anything were never won by the parent who was angriest in the room, only by the parent who'd shown up with the most patient, boring, undeniable paper trail. I thought about Marisol's scorebooks, page after page of careful, unglamorous handwriting, kept for 3 seasons by a woman with no stake in any of this beyond loving the game, and understood finally finally exactly what Odalie meant. Bodie didn't come to the hearing. We'd talked about it together, and he'd said, quietly, that he trusted me to handle it, that he'd rather be at a friend's house not thinking about baseball at all for one Saturday morning, and I'd agreed, relieved, honestly, not to have him sitting in a conference room listening to grown adults argue about whether his grief had been used against him. The hearing took place in a small conference room at the league's regional office on a Saturday morning, Desmond seated across the table with a representative from the Coaches Association he'd requested be present, Odalie presiding alongside 2 other board members, and me sitting beside Marisol, who'd insisted on coming even though nobody had required her to, her own worn scorebook stacked in front of her like a kind of armor. Desmond's opening account of the season was almost identical to the explanations he'd given me in the equipment shed parking lot months earlier. Normal roster rotation, load management, a coach's discretion to develop his full roster rather than overly rely on any single player, however talented. It was a reasonable-sounding story, delivered with the same easy confidence he'd always had, and I watched, with a sinking feeling, one of the board members nodding along to it as though it might genuinely be enough to end the matter right there. It was Callahan's charts projected onto a small screen at Odalie's request that changed the temperature of the room. Watching the caught-stealing rates and on-base percentages laid out side by side against the sharply inverted playing time allocation, in a room full of people who understood baseball statistics well enough to know exactly what they were looking at, made normal roster rotation sound suddenly much thinner than it had a moment before. Odalie then read, without editorializing, Perpetua Amara's written statement describing the prior season's pattern with Foster, followed by a summary of the newly rediscovered Julius Okonkwo complaint from 3 seasons earlier. Desmond's easy confidence finally cracked somewhere in the middle of that second account, his jaw tightening, his eyes moving toward his own representative rather than anyone else in the room. When Odalie asked him directly whether he could explain why 3 separate families, across 3 separate seasons, each in the midst of a documented family hardship, had experienced nearly identical, statistically unsupported declines in their son's playing time in favor of his own son, Desmond didn't have an answer that survived more than a few seconds of silence. He said finally that he'd never consciously set out to favor Weston over anyone, that he loved coaching, that he genuinely believed he'd made the best decisions he could for the team each time. He didn't deny the pattern once it was laid out in front of him with 3 families worth of documentation. He just couldn't explain it in a way that made it sound like anything other than exactly what it was. The board's decision came 2 weeks later in writing, and it was more thorough than I'd let myself hope for going in. Desmond's coaching certification with the league was revoked, effective immediately, with a formal notation in the regional coaching database that any future certification application would require disclosure of the findings from this hearing. The board also implemented, at Odalie's recommendation, a new policy requiring any coach with a child on the same roster to have playing time decisions for that position group reviewed by a second independent coach or league official, a rule that several other regional leagues, Odalie told me later, ended up quietly adopting themselves once word of the case made its way through the wider coaching community. I read the letter twice standing in the kitchen before I called Bodie in from the backyard, where he'd been throwing a tennis ball against the fence in the aimless, half-hearted way he'd taken up doing that spring instead of practicing with real purpose. I sat him down at the same kitchen table where his father used to fill out lineup cards and read him the parts of the letter that mattered most, watched his face move through something complicated, not quite triumph, not quite relief, something closer to a kid finally being told, by people with real authority, that he hadn't imagined the thing he'd felt happening to him. He asked quietly whether this meant he could catch again. I told him it did. He went and got his mitt out of the front hall closet that same afternoon and oiled it at the kitchen table while I made dinner, the first time he'd touched it in almost 2 months. Bodie finished the season under a new interim coach, an older man named Percival Renard, who'd coached in the league for over a decade and had a reputation, Marisol told me, for being scrupulously fair almost to a fault. Bodie started every remaining game behind the plate. He caught the final 2 games of the regular season and both playoff games with the same steady, unshowy competence his father had spent years teaching him, throughout 4 runners in the championship game alone, a game the team ended up winning by 2 runs in extra innings, Bodie calling the final pitch of the game from behind the plate, with the same calm his father used to describe as the best thing about watching him play. I sat in the stands for that final game next to Marisol, who'd kept score for it the way she'd kept score for every single game that season, and when the last out was recorded, she closed her scorebook, looked at me, and said quietly that she thought this might be the last season she kept score for this program, that 3 years of doing it out of love for the game had turned, somewhere in the middle of that spring, into something that felt more like keeping a case file, and she thought she might be ready to just watch a baseball game again without needing to track every single inning of it. Perpetua Amara called me the week after the championship, having heard the outcome through Marisol, who'd kept her updated throughout the hearing process even though she had no obligation to. She told me she'd finally decided, after everything, to file her own formal complaint about what had happened to Foster, now that the league had demonstrated it was actually willing to investigate rather than let a well-liked coach's reputation carry him through unquestioned. She said watching our case succeed had done something she hadn't expected, not exactly regret over the season she'd let go quietly, but a kind of retroactive permission to stop blaming herself for for not fighting harder at the time, when she genuinely hadn't had a Marisol or a Callahan, or a formal record of a prior complaint to build a case on the way I eventually had. Weston still plays in the league, on a different team the following season, under a different coach, and I've made a point more than once of telling Bodie that none of this was Weston's fault, that an 11-year-old boy doesn't choose whether his father decides to build a season around protecting him at someone else's expense. Bodie seems to understand that better than I expected him to, in the specific, generous way grieving kids sometimes surprise you by understanding things adults are still working through themselves. He waved to Weston across the parking lot at a tournament the following spring, a small, ordinary gesture that meant more to me watching it than almost anything else that whole difficult year. I still have Marisol's scorebooks, photographed and printed, along with Callahan's charts and the copy of the board's final written decision, tucked into a folder in the same drawer where I keep the lineup cards Rutger used to fill out at our kitchen table with a mechanical pencil, working out batting orders late into the evening the way some men work out crossword puzzles, purely for the pleasure of getting it exactly right. I don't look at that folder often, but I want it there, the whole record, for the day Bodie is old enough to ask me the full version of the season he mostly remembers now as the year he almost quit baseball for good. Not the version where a beloved family coach simply rotated his roster the way coaches do, but the true one where a scorekeeper who'd technically finished her own job 3 seasons earlier kept showing up anyway, kept a record nobody asked her to keep, and handed a grieving mother the one thing she needed most, that spring, proof that what she was watching happen to her son was actually happening.